Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us for this event to discuss how far democracy is becoming a geostrategic priority for the European Union. This event is co-organized by Carnegie Europe and the European Partnership for Democracy. My name is Richard Youngs. I'm working at Carnegie Europe. We are organizing this debate to mark the launch of our first annual review of European democracy support, covering the year of 2021. 2021 was a very busy year in which the EU member states, non-EU European governments made many new commitments to strengthen their support to democracy, both within the European Union and more globally. Our first annual review tries to take the pulse of these commitments and how far EU institutions and member states have followed through on these new commitments. Everyone on the call will be aware today there are many annual reports looking at the state of democracy itself around the world. Our aim in this first annual review of democracy support was to accompany these reports with a look at European democracy support, not at democracy itself, but how far European governments are actually meeting their commitments to support democratic norms. This report is the first of what will become an annual series. It's prepared under the rubric of the European Democracy Hub that the European Partnership for Democracy and Carnegie set up last year. So there's a lot to discuss and debate. We have a short discussion this morning of just 45 minutes. Everybody's busy on a Monday morning. We will hear, first of all, from my colleague Ken Godfrey, who manages the European Democracy Hub, together with myself and colleagues from Carnegie Europe. He will just put on the table a few of the key headlines that came out of our annual review. We're then very pleased to welcome Jenny Ohlsson, who's Sweden's State Secretary for Development Cooperation. We will hear a keynote from her. Then we will turn to Chiara Adamo, who's Director for Democracy, amongst other issues, at INTPA, the Commission's Directorate for International Partnerships. Then we'll have time for some informal discussion to focus on what the EU did well and perhaps less well during 2021, member states as well, and in particular to consider what key democracy-related developments are likely to be on the agenda in 2022. Thank you very much to everyone for joining us. Please submit questions as we're listening to the speakers, and we'll try and get those to our panelists. Ken, let's hear first of all from you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Very delighted to be here. I'll be very brief in terms of the introduction of the review and encourage everybody to read it after the event. What I would say is that we looked at a number of the key trends for 2021 and their impact, the impact of those trends on democracy. Chief among them, of course, is COVID-19, the pandemic, the impact of that on government policies as well as government spending. Second of those, we thought, was a desire for greater collective action at European level that's really demonstrated by Team Europe initiatives, but also the collective procurement on vaccines and the desire for strategic autonomy on the part of a number of European states. The third of those big trends was the return of the United States to a more pro-democratic agenda that had a number of impacts on European governments. They were diverse impacts. The sort of disaster of the withdrawal from Afghanistan was obviously very detrimental from a humanitarian point of view, but also emblematic from a democracy point of view. And at the same time, there's a continuation of the US-China rivalry, which we saw have a sort of sharpening of EU focus on and deterioration maybe of EU relations with China over the course of the year. In terms of policies, there were lots of policies that were released by European governments as well as by the European Union. On the part of European governments, we felt that there was a greater link between geopolitical priorities and democracy. At least rhetorically, there was a really strong link between democracy in a number of these policies and the geopolitical circumstances. And also, we felt that European Union, there was a greater diversity in the number of policies that dealt with democracy, both within Europe and outside. So dealing with media, dealing with participation, dealing with rule of law, etc. On the funding side, we also saw a number of steps forward on the part of the European Union institutions, and that's primarily because the European Union member states agreed to a new budget over the course of the year. So there was a rollout of new objectives, greater focus on democracy in the funding, we felt, and I think we'll hear about the Team Europe Democracy Initiative as well later. On the part of EU member states, it was very difficult for us to have reliable data of how much European governments have spent on democracy support. We could see sometimes a sort of increase or decrease. It's very difficult to say how much. On the part of EU member states, I think we need to highlight the sort of clarity of vision of Sweden. It's very clear. I mean, I'm sure we'll hear about it just now. And the other thing to maybe note, sort of a headline, is the fact that the German coalition treaty does really set up some new policies on the German government side. Now, when it comes to, excuse me, the sanctions and conditionality, so the link between trade, spending, other priorities, we saw the EU also roll out new human rights sanctions regime, global sanctions regime. It was agreed to at the end of 2020 and rolled out in 2021. That had an impact on a number of different policy areas. Yet we feel as though, globally speaking, in terms of conditionality and sanctions, there was quite a lot of inconsistency in the application of those on the part of European member states and therefore the European Union. So please have a read of the review. It has a lot of details in terms of both also linking to peace building, security, as well as specific examples of sanctions, specific examples of aid. So I really encourage everybody to have a read of it. I'll just end by noting 4 of the key conclusions that we came to. The first of those is that there's really a very clear momentum on the part of the EU and European Union member states to address many of the challenges to democracy within the European Union. So there's a whole host of new policies that were rolled out in 2021 in that regard. There's also, secondly, sort of new toolbox for the European at European level with that allows the institutions and member states, as well as European governments, I would say more broadly, to deal with some of the challenges to democracy around the world. That includes sanctions, includes sort of bolder use of conditionality, stepping up the use of aid, and a desire for greater coordination and cooperation. However, thirdly, there is a lack of coherence in the application of many of these tools. And that's something that we'll be looking out for in 2022. And sort of summarizing all of it, I think we end the review by noting that really lots of the work that's been done prior to 2021 and the work in 2021 has created really solid foundations for European governments and the EU to take a step forward in terms of its democracy support, their democracy support. And 2022 is not going to tell us everything, but it will provide some indications of how strong European democracy support will be in the future, both within Europe as well as outside.
Thanks, Ken, for that introduction. It is a long report. We deliberately included a lot of empirical information so that readers can get into the detail of understanding what exactly the EU and member states have done and not done in the name of democracy support. We've deliberately included internal democracy policies as well as external democracy policies to reflect the very often made point now that challenges externally are no longer separate from the challenges facing democracy within Europe. And as Ken pointed out, 2021 was a year in which we had a lot of these very powerful external or exogenous influences impacting upon democracy policy, allied with very important political changes and commitments within Europe itself. So the interplay of those external and internal factors made it a particularly significant year, in our view, for a whole range of democracy and human rights commitments. As Ken said, we go through in some detail member states' different policies and commitments. Sweden has long been seen as the member state perhaps most committed to democracy support policies. We're very pleased to have State Secretary Ohlsson with us this morning to hear from her, perhaps what Sweden has done, what you feel Sweden needs and can do more of going forwards, and also from the Swedish perspective, how you see some of the overarching debates regarding European commitment to democracy. So State Secretary, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Richard, and thank you, Ken, and good morning, everyone. Dear colleagues, I'd like to begin by extending my sincere thanks to the European Partnership for Democracy, to Carnegie Europe, and the authors of the report. I'm very happy to participate today in this discussion. The report, Annual Review of European Democracy Support, really comes at a time when the trend of democratic backsliding is continuing and has been exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic. As the latest International IDEA Global State of Democracy report states, the number of countries moving in an authoritarian direction in 2020 outnumbered those going in a democratic direction. This trend is also identified in the Annual Review of European Democracy Support, which states that during the COVID-19 pandemic, autocracies became more autocratic, democracies became less democratic. The shrinking democratic space is extremely worrying, and it calls for concrete action and determination by all friends of democracy in order to counter this negative trend. Actions must be taken both within our union and also externally, as no democracy is immune to today's challenges. The EU needs to be a strong voice and advocate in the promotion and defense of democratic principles, as these are the core value of the European Union. An important part of this is to explain and recall why democracy is the best foundation for building a sustainable society, how it enables everyone to be involved in creating a common future, how democracy is the best foundation to safeguard human rights, to reduce corruption, and create stability, security, and economic prosperity. I also want to take this opportunity to emphasize that gender equality is also a foundation for a well-functioning democracy. So, dear colleagues, there are not many places in the world where you see all these people taking to the streets demanding less democracy and more autocracy. Quite the opposite. Despite the many challenges that democracies face, the demand for democracy remains strong, and it's up to us to ensure that those fighting for democracy are supported and able to continue their work. This is why democracy support through the international development cooperation is so important, and why this overview of European democracy support provides us with an important check on our current policies to help determine what has been successful and where more work is needed. The report outlines the clear challenge to democracy support, but also some of the positive initiatives and activities that have been taken forward during 2021. This includes, among others, the rolling out of the EU Action Plan on Democracy and Human Rights 2020 to 2024, the launch of the Team Europe Democracy and the new Neighborhood Development and International Cooperation Instrument, Global Europe, which has been a dedicated thematic program for human rights and democracy, apart from the geographic programs where these issues should be mainstreamed. For our part, Sweden has named the defense and promotion of democracy a top priority of our foreign policy, which has been developed through the cross-cutting foreign policy initiative Drive for Democracy, launched in 2019. We see it as a strategic priority to establish a counter-narrative to authoritarian trends and to defend democracy's institution and its promoters. We have increased support to the civil society organizations, to human rights defenders, to journalists, and to media workers, all of which are essential actors for a living, sustainable democracy. And much like our last EU presidency in 2009, we'd like to assist in any way that we can in forwarding the democracy work of the EU during our upcoming presidency in the EU 2023. We plan to put these issues high on the agenda, not least through discussions on the midterm review of the EU Action Plan on Human Rights and Democracy, and follow up on the US-led Summit for Democracy. The Drive for Democracy and our feminist foreign policy form part of the basis of our commitments to the Summit for Democracy and the ongoing Year of Action. The EU has an important role to play in the follow-up of the summit, as well as individual countries. Collaboration with like-minded countries makes us all stronger, and it takes our joint effort for democracy forward. Dear colleagues, we need to continue to work to ensure the promotion and protection of democratic principles high on the agenda. Reporting and data on the current state of democracy and democracy support is therefore important and much needed. Looking ahead, I believe we need to strive to increase our support for democracy, human rights, and the rule of law. And again, we must step up our common effort to explain why democracy is the most inclusive and sustainable form of government. So thank you again for the report. Thank you for summarizing it so well, Ken, and for inviting me to launch this event. I hope you will have a fruitful discussion. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jenny. I'm aware that you have to leave us for another event. Perhaps just before
on human rights. Another event on human rights.
On human rights. Yeah. So just before you dash off, maybe I can just ask you one question on the Summit for Democracy that you mentioned. So we are now beginning what's been defined as a year of action leading up supposedly to a second Summit for Democracy. As you mentioned, this is a priority for Sweden and more broadly for Europe. I just wonder if you have clear yet what Sweden's contribution might be, or what you think the European contribution to this process might be, and what we should be looking for.
Hold on. As I just started my job on the first day of the summit, I am the wrong person to reply. I mean, we have reported on commitments and tasks connected to the conference, but I have to get back to you on the work ahead. I mean, this is high on our agenda, but your question was on future commitments, or how did I understand you? Correct? I think we as you know, we have a broad democratic agenda, so I think. Part of the work will also be to see where our efforts are most needed, where we need to strengthen, what is being done also by others. But of course, representing Sweden and a feminist foreign policy, there is, of course, always a gender perspective that we will come with naturally. But in terms of other focuses ahead, I'll come back to you. We will have to come back to you on that.
Great. Thanks very much. Thanks for joining us and contributing. Let's hand over to Chiara. Chiara, amongst other responsibilities, has within her remit oversight of the new Team Europe Democracy Initiative. Democracy Hub actually forms part of this initiative that's supposed to draw together a lot of the disparate democracy efforts going on across Europe. So she's well placed to give us an overview of how she sees the evolution of European democracy commitments and what might be some of the important developments we should look for in 2022. Chiara, let's hear from you, please.
Yes, thank you. First of all, both EPD and Carnegie for this annual review, which I read really with great interest as the Secretary of State just mentioned, in the current context is ever more important to really have evidence-based approach to broaden our knowledge base, make sure that we can really use data, use analysis, and hear different perspectives to inform our joint actions. And I'm quite pleased that your initiative will also be supported through the Team Europe Democracy Initiative in a broader sense. So we do need also really democracy support, operational research, look at the impact of what we do on the ground. So after this introduction, I was very captured by the title of your conference today, is Democracy, Geopolitical Priority. And on this one, I just want to say one word. I mean, we should all remember that democracy is not only a geopolitical priority, is first of all a core value upon which the European Union is funded alongside human rights and rule of law. And of course, it translates in a key objective, a strategic priority in that sense, because it is a core value. And of course, from the perspective of international partnership, it is also very much about realizing the Agenda 2030, because we shouldn't forget as the G16, although it doesn't mention the word democracy, interestingly enough, it's all about really making sure that whatever we do is informed by the rule of law, by democratic institutions, by inclusivity. So it's really an enabler for all we do, and I think this translates in this von der Leyen Commission, and I'm glad that in some parts of the review this was also acknowledged. It's both the internal dimension and the external dimension, as you mentioned, Richard. Internally, we are guided by this European democracy plan, the EDAP, but you've seen we don't work in silos, so this also have very strong external actions, and it connects with what Jenny Ohlsson was mentioning, the external roadmap, which is really the Human Rights and Democracy Action Plan. So I think in 2020, 2021, we set the political framework. It is a priority. And last year, as the Secretary of State also mentioned, we set also the operational toolbox that we have at our disposal, namely, for instance, the Global Europe instrument. And this, I believe, should allow us to be more strategic in our response and in our democracy support. I would say in three ways. The first is really being more strategic in connecting the dots between what we can do in terms of supporting democracy and democratic institutions in terms of capacity building with our partner countries. And that is mainly done and will be mainly done through our geographic programs. And I'm really happy to say that, I mean, looking at all the work which was done in 2021, now we publish on the website in a single page all the multi-indicative programs, country by country. You will see that some 2/3 of them have priority intervention on good governance, and more than half of them are specifically prioritizing democratic governance features. So that will be really a strong basis for us, the EU, to really reach out and develop policy dialogues with a good number of partner countries, and making sure that we can really assist reforms and capacity building. On the other hand, we need to be comprehensive, so we need to join this bilateral cooperation with what we can do on our hand, bottom up, by supporting civil society, by supporting independent human rights oversight bodies, but also journalists and media freedom, anti-corruption bodies, etc., etc. And this we have announced. I mean, President von der Leyen announced really in the aftermath, on the occasion of the Biden summit last year, a bold new program for 1.5 billion euros dedicated specifically to democracy and human rights promotion. And these two are not disconnected, so our action really needs to be synergic in that. The second point, in terms of being more strategic, is, as you mentioned, joint efforts. Joint efforts, first of all, with our member states. As Team Europe, we are the biggest donor in the world on democracy support, and we shouldn't be shy about it. You can have different ways of counting it, but whatever we can, however we count it, we are really a big force on democracy support together. And one of the lessons of the COVID was really the realization that in order to really cope with global challenges as this one, we need to be more coordinated, we need to be more visible, and we need to join forces on the ground to really provide impact and scale. And this is the main aim of this Team Europe Democracy. We are now joined by 14 member states. And work has already been launched as for the knowledge stream. and it will be very quickly also launched in terms of the other components, which are a network, kind of a community of practice network, and concrete delivery of actions on the ground. So we hope that this Global Team Europe Democracy Initiative will be the launching pad for further Team Europe initiatives at the country and regional level. So thank you very much. Maybe last but not least, you mentioned the policy coherence. On that one, I would also say last year we set the basis in a number of ways. For instance, we renewed the human rights-based approach methodology to international partnerships, and we really endeavor to put the EU way of working, the EU way of operating, which is based on democratic values, in all we do, including the last strategy we produced, which is the Global Gateway. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Chiara. So a more strategic, useful conclusions, I think, more strategic use of what now is a relatively high level of funding coming out of the European institutions, and a need for synergies, including between external and internal policy, and the need to get a large number of member states more fully bought into the democracy agenda. For listeners, by the way, one quite striking conclusion that comes out of our review is that despite all the rhetoric, still only really a handful of member states are dedicating meaningful amounts of resources to democracy policies. So clearly there's something there, scope there for a lot of improvement during 2022. We're getting some questions in, but first I just want to bring Ken back into the conversation to build on Chiara's kind of speculation about what 2022 might bring. Ken, you and I in the review worked towards the conclusion that 2021 had seen an unprecedented set of new commitments, action plans, internal, external, various new geographical programs, civil society roadmaps, the Team Europe initiative, the new sanctions regime, a whole raft of new legislation coming in relating to internal European democracy initiatives, the rule of law mechanism, the European Democracy Action Plan, the Digital Services Act, so on and so forth. So a large number of initiatives relevant to democracy, but we make the case that really we still need to have a better idea of how these are likely to be, or how fully these are likely to be implemented during 2022. So you and I gave some thought to the kind of key moments of stress test or opportunity that democracy policy will focus in 2022. Just run through some of your thoughts on that, Ken.
Yeah, I think, thanks, Richard. I think both the states actually and Chiara, you alluded to a few of them, because I do think you could kind of divide them. It's useful to divide maybe some of those stress tests into internal ones and external ones. And on the external side, I think that the Team Europe democracy, it's 14 member states, as Chiara just mentioned. That's significant, really is significant. And the ability of that Team Europe democracy to encourage greater cooperation will be one of the key issues. But I don't think there'll be one particular moment there. On the coherent side, I think there will be many moments that we look at where we can see how much the European Union, and by extension, of course, the member states, are prioritizing democracy support. And there, I mean, right now, of course, there's issues in Ukraine, borders of Ukraine, but there'll be a number of different elections. Kenya, for example, what happens in Afghanistan with negotiations with the Taliban. There'll be many different things that we will be looking out for in 2022 with regards to foreign policy. Internally, I'd say that there are some specific dates to look out for. The first of those, and I think the most important, is the rule of law mechanism. So the use of that, there will be an ECJ judgment on the legality of the rule of law conditionality mechanism. If, as most people, I would say, expect that the European Court of Justice rules that this is a legal mechanism, whether the institutions take quick steps to take action vis-a-vis Poland and Hungary, most primarily, will be very important and will demonstrate the desire of many member states to deal with those problems, rule of law problems within the EU. Second is probably the Hungarian elections. The Hungarian elections are obviously vitally important. We saw that there's a commitment now for an ODIHR mission to Hungary. That they are very important because of the decision making also in foreign policy and the unanimity in terms of foreign policy and the role that Hungary has been playing in the last year with regards to blocking or undermining some collective positions. It's not just Hungary, but Hungary is a very important player in that regard. And third is the Conference on the Future of Europe. So the Conference on the Future of Europe is set to end by the end of the French presidency of the Council of the EU. And, will citizens' input, will it be taken into account? Will it form one of the key conclusions on the Conference on the Future of Europe? And will it lead to something that's a bit more sustainable in the future? Because there is a danger that many of the sort of long-standing, let's say, critiques of democracy at the European level come to the fore once again and say, it's all well and good for citizens to participate, but if their voice is not actually heard and it's just decided by people in Brussels, etc., then I think it will be very detrimental for democracy around Europe. So those are some of the key things I think to look out for. There are more, of course, but those are some of the key ones.
Thanks very much, Ken. We don't have too long left. I'm just trying to select a number of the questions that are coming in. Perhaps I can put two to you, Chiara. We have some questions about COVID and how COVID impacts the Commission's aid policies, if in 2022 we're likely to move into a post-COVID period, or if a lot of your work in 2022 is still going to be aimed at getting through the COVID emergency, and if so, what's the relationship between all your COVID funding on the one hand and democracy and human rights work on the other hand? So the COVID issue, and then from Pekka in the European Parliament, a question specifically on what role there might be for the European Parliament within the Team Europe initiative, and if the European Parliament's work, particularly on election observation, but also on other issues, can be brought systematically into that question. And then Ken, I guess one for you and for me as well, perhaps from Roger Casali, for example, on the what are the prospects of the Conference on the Future of Europe will actually lead to a kind of genuine upgrade in internal European democracy policy, including through the potential creation of a permanent citizen mechanism. So you might want to come back on that one, Ken, in the few minutes we have left to us. Chiara, do you want to offer a few thoughts on this, on the COVID issue in the European Parliament?
Yeah, sure. It is clear that we are still in the context of the COVID response. And I mean, the most striking illustration is really the need to step up efforts to assist global vaccination. This will be the key topic, one of the key topics for our EU African Union summit this month. And at the level of the European Union, it is really number one priority, making sure that we can guarantee equity in the way not only the vaccines are shared, but ensuring that vaccination can be provided, and this entails a wealth of measures which go really very much into ensuring strengthening of the health systems, looking at the skills of the people, making sure that all of the population can have the same types of rights to health, be it, and with a specific attention to vulnerable population living in rural areas. So it's a big issue. It is in a way linked to democratic principles, because it's really linked to ensuring that equality and inclusivity are taken on board in whatever we are endeavoring to do. More directly, we are also continuing very targeted measures in supporting human rights and democracy in the context of the COVID and post-COVID, because as someone mentioned at the beginning of this conference, unfortunately, the COVID period also generated a wealth of backlash and restrictions on fundamental freedoms. So we really stepped up our actions, for instance, on protecting journalists at risk. Big issue. I mean, the number of harassment, but also even physical violence and killings toward journalists has been on the rise. So we have deployed a number of support programs, including our Human Rights Defenders program, but also specific programs to ensure that independent media, investigative media, can really survive this COVID context, because the media business is ever more complicated. There is all disinformation, of course, issue also around the vaccines, which would open a conference in itself. But is to say, and also violence against women. I mean, we really stepped up. One thing that I would like to mention, and that it will continue in this year, the urgent response to address violence against women and girls and also children, which has really seen a spike, unfortunately, starting with the lockdowns. And there we were able to support with sheltering, with really very urgent type of action. And on the broader level, unfortunately, the COVID context is having a tremendous consequence at the socioeconomic level. So, of course, all of our support is informed by this new context. And the idea is really to make sure that through the global recovery, we can go back to the SDGs and actually make sure that we all get there. But it's complicated. The second,
just very quickly on the Parliament.
On the Parliament, very quickly, indeed, we would very much like to have continue the conversation with the Parliament bilaterally. We have interesting projects on democracy, including the parliamentary strengthening through the Inter Pares, that it's already ongoing, where we develop peer exchanges between parliamentarians and parliamentary staffs from Europe and partner countries. I mean, all these type of issues, or working on the political parties. I mean, there are so many actions related to democracy support where we would be very, very glad to bring in the Parliament and the staff.
Okay, Ken, just very quickly, anything else to add on the conference?
I turn it back to you, Richard. I think that there is a chance that there will be something a bit more permanent. I think that there have been lessons learned. We're involved in it indirectly. Many of our members are involved in it directly. I do think that there is a possibility, but and there will be lessons learned, because it's the first time that it's been conducted. But I think what I mentioned before is very important. There needs to be a bottom, the recommendations that are made bottom up need to be taken into account at the very end of this process. But Richard, you've done lots of research on this issue.
I mean, actually, quite a few of the people asking this question about the conference, Roger and Sav and others, have been in discussions about what follows the conference. It seems to me that the prospect of some kind of permanent mechanism now is seriously on the agenda. Not all the citizens' recommendations, of which there are a large number, are going to find their way into concrete policy output. But it does seem to me that the plenary, of which there have been several sessions now, is at least taking the citizen panels seriously. So there is the prospect for some real qualitative change. But to the people asking these questions, I would also point out that what we do in the review is to look at the large number of other democratic reform issues that need to be taken into consideration beyond the conference itself and beyond the citizen panels. In particular, the Commission has a large new budget that is supposed to fund democracy actors that will be coming into operation during 2022, and is supposed to mirror some of the lessons learned in the EU's external democracy support. So the case we make in the review is that could be a really interesting area where there's supposed to be emerging between the kind of synergy that Chiara was mentioning between the external and internal democracy funding. We're almost out of time. Just to finish off very, very briefly, I will ask Ken and Chiara for their thoughts on the Summit for Democracy process. This was kicked off in December, supposedly the beginning of some kind of more systematic coordination between democracies globally, including European democracies. We are still waiting for democracies to step forward and make really concrete commitments to this process, but it is supposed to lead up to an even more important second summit at the end of 2022. So I put to both Ken and Chiara to finish us off what their hopes for the second summit would be and what they think European states, European EU institutions could add distinctive to this summit process. Ken.
That's a big question. I'd say one of the lessons I would say from that, we detected a bit of apprehension on the part of some European governments with regards to this first summit. But that apprehension, I would say, led to not as much visibility on the part of European governments as one would have hoped. Particularly, for example, the European Union came out, I think it was the week before, announced 1.5 billion of new funding. That was not really picked up by press. Most of the things that were picked up were really with regards to the US administration. I think that there are commitments for sure that have been made by European governments that it would be good to really underline are new or particularly strong. The hopes for 2022, I would say twofold. One is maybe a disentangling somehow of that apprehension or from the sort of other objectives that many European governments see in the summit, particularly vis-a-vis the US-China rivalry. So I think unpicking that out of the summit and basically saying, this is for an actual principle, the values that Chiara was mentioning before, is important. And I would also hope for greater European cooperation with regards to the summit. So I think that there's a real strong case to be made for European governments to sort of band together and come up with maybe some sort of flagship initiative with regards to the second summit.
And Chiara.
Yeah, I must say I quite agree with Ken. I think the Summit of Democracy will be one of the first tests for the Team Europe democracy, for our new way of really working jointly together with our member states. We do expect indeed to look for the concrete commitments which were put forward in December, because the list is not yet out. And of course, from our perspective, it will be also interesting to reach out to those countries who made commitments, outside Europe, to really see in which way we can support. Another expectation I have is that it's really, given that now there is a bit more time, really more inclusive process. I mean, the European Union insisted from the beginning that this should not just be a governmental conference, but a all of society conference, with the inclusion of civil society. And also we very much underline the importance of bringing on board the youth. And Commissioner Urpilainen was personally involved, for instance, on the side event of the first summit on youth engagement, and this is something that a conversation that we are having and continuing with the Americans to make sure that we deliver concretely on that front. I expect that some of the flagships that we are going to carry forward, including on political participation of women and youth, or on media freedom, will sit very well at the summit, and hopefully also give this distinctive visibility of what the EU can contribute to, and what the EU stands for at the last summit. And I also want to pick up on the intervention by the Swedish Secretary of State, which is very promising, because of course they come in 2023. So it's not just a matter of having 1 year of action. I mean, democracy is a long-term process. So very happy that the Swedes want to take this forward and prioritize democracy in 2023.
So let's hope indeed that the European contribution to the summit is significant and innovative. We've run out of time for our debate this morning. So thank you to Chiara for taking time out of your busy schedule for joining us and to Ken on my behalf and Ken's behalf and our teammates within the Democracy Hub. I hope people find the annual review interesting. It was our first attempt at preparing this, so people are invited to give feedback and ideas of how we might altogether improve the reporting and the monitoring and the transparency of European democracy commitments. Clearly, 2022 is set to be an intensive year for democracy policy. There'll be many difficult challenges. The current situation with Russia and Ukraine will clearly have a spillover effect on European democracy policy in many, many different ways. There may also more positively be opportunities for the EU and member states to use this range of new instruments they've introduced also to greater effect and to improve the efficiency of European democracy policies. I think the overarching conclusion that we got from doing our first review was that there's a lot going on. As Ken said, most of this doesn't get into the headlines, but there is at least the possibility of using the resources and initiatives that have been elaborated in a more effective way. There's a lot going on, but it still tends to be very, very disparate and isn't really drawn together in a particularly strategic way, in the same way that EU policies are, say, in the area of defense or security or climate or migration. So hence the way we framed the question this morning, given our conviction that amongst all the useful things being done on democracy, the really key test for 2022 is whether the EU can make democracy a strategic priority, how it relates to other strategic priorities that the EU is pursuing. So with that concluding word, thank you to everyone for joining us. We are already preparing the 2022 review, so please do give us feedback, and we hope to join all of you in future discussions on this topic. Thank you very much.